The air at Gate 3 of Marine Corps Base Quantico had the consistency of a hot, wet towel. It was an old gate, a forgotten artery leading to a less trafficked section of the sprawling base, a place of cracked asphalt and sun-bleached concrete barriers. The humidity of a Virginia August pressed down with a physical weight, silencing the cicadas and making the simple act of breathing a conscious effort. The world was seen through a shimmering haze of heat rising from the pavement. The only sounds were the lazy drone of a window unit air conditioner fighting a losing battle in the guard shack and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires of a passing vehicle. It was a place where ambition went to die, a purgatory of tedious vigilance where the greatest threat was usually heatstroke or a profound, soul-crushing boredom. It was in this crucible of monotony that Corporal Damian Vance reigned. Vance was a man sculpted from the rigid clay of Marine Corps regulations, or at least his interpretation of them. His uniform was a work of art, creases so sharp they looked like they could draw blood. His boots polished to a black mirror that reflected the oppressive sky. He stood with a posture that was less about military bearing and more about a desperate assertion of dominance over his tiny, insignificant kingdom. To the two lance corporals sweating in the shack, Vance was authority personified. He moved with a swagger that suggested he was personally holding back the forces of chaos from overwhelming the base, one vehicle inspection at a time. His voice, a grating baritone that always seemed a few decibels too loud, was the soundtrack to their sweltering afternoon. He was the king of Gate 3, and he never let anyone forget it. His kingdom was small, but his arrogance was boundless. He saw the world through a narrow lens ground from boot camp truisms and barracks bravado. There were Marines and there were civilians. There were those who followed his orders, and there were those who needed to be taught to follow his orders. It was a simple, comforting binary that allowed him to navigate his existence with the unearned confidence of a man who has never had his foundational beliefs truly challenged. He was a perfect product of an institutional culture that sometimes mistook volume for leadership and rigidity for strength. He was a small man occupying a small space, who believed himself to be a giant. She arrived without a sound. One moment, the space near the pedestrian entrance was empty, shimmering in the heat. The next, she was there. She stood with a stillness that was almost unnatural, a gray rock in the sluggish river of the afternoon. She wore plain gray slacks, a simple black top and sensible, worn-out running shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her face, devoid of makeup, was plain and unremarkable. She was of average height and slight build, the kind of person who could disappear into a crowd of two. She carried no purse, no phone was visible, and her hands were clasped loosely behind her back. She simply stood, her gaze fixed on the road leading onto the base, her expression a perfect, unreadable neutrality. She did not seem to be bothered by the oppressive heat. Not a single bead of sweat was visible on her brow. To Corporal Vance, she was an anomaly, and anomalies were irritants. His eyes, constantly scanning his domain for any deviation from the norm, locked onto her. His mind, a blunt instrument of categorization, immediately began to process the data through its well-worn filters. Civilian, female, alone, not dressed for the weather, waiting. The gears of his prejudice turned, clicking into a familiar conclusion. A dependent, probably some young lieutenant's new girlfriend, waiting to be picked up, likely without the proper credentials, ready to waste his valuable time with excuses and pleas. It was a scenario he had played out a dozen times, a chance to flex his authority and remind some clueless civilian that this was his world, governed by his rules. He let her stand there for a full 10 minutes, a petty exercise in power. He watched her from the corner of his eye while he meticulously inspected the ID of a retiring master gunnery sergeant, making the old warrior wait an extra 30 seconds just because he could. He observed her stillness, and it began to grate on him. She wasn't fidgeting. She wasn't checking a watch she didn't wear. She wasn't shielding her eyes from the sun. She just stood, patient, motionless. It was the calm of a predator, not the restlessness of prey, though his mind was incapable of making such a distinction. He saw it only as defiance, a quiet, passive-aggressive challenge to his authority. Finally, he decided to act. He strode from the meager shade of the guard shack's awning, his boots crunching on the loose gravel with deliberate force. He approached her not as a sentry making an inquiry, but as a landowner confronting a trespasser. He stopped a few feet away, planting his feet in a wide, aggressive stance, a posture he had learned from movies about drill instructors. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, the word ma'am dripping with a condescending sweetness that was meant to be anything but polite. The woman's gaze shifted from the road to him. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, and they met his without a flicker of intimidation or deference. They were like the lenses of a camera, recording data without emotion.
No, corporal.
"You cannot." The precision of her response threw him. She had identified his rank instantly, without a glance at the chevrons on his sleeve. And her tone was not what he expected. It was flat, clinical, devoid of the anxiety or annoyance he was used to eliciting. It was the tone of a superior correcting a subordinate, a fact that his ego refused to acknowledge but his subconscious registered with a faint prickle of unease. He bristled, his neck flushing red. "You're in a restricted area. This is an active military checkpoint. You can't just stand here." "I am aware of my location," she said, her voice still perfectly level. "I am waiting for my escort." "Your escort?" Vance scoffed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh. "Everyone needs an escort to get on this base without a valid ID. Who's picking you up? Your boyfriend? Let me guess, he's a brand new second lieutenant who thinks he runs the place." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial growl he thought was intimidating. "Let me give you a little advice. Tell your butterbar boyfriend that this gate is run by United States Marines, and we don't bend the rules for anyone." The woman did not react. She did not flinch at his proximity, nor did her expression change at his insult. It was like talking to a statue. This infuriated Vance more than any argument could have. He was a performer, and he required an audience that reacted. Her calm was a negation of his power, a silent refusal to participate in the drama he was trying to create. It was a lioness allowing a jackal to dance and yap at the very edge of its kill radius, utterly unimpressed and unconcerned. "Are you hearing me?" he snapped, his voice rising. The two lance corporals in the shack were now watching, their faces a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. This was Corporal Vance's show, and it was reaching its crescendo. "I heard you, Corporal," the woman replied. Her gaze drifted past him, back to the empty road. "You are making a series of incorrect assumptions based on incomplete data. I advise you to return to your post." The language she used was another discordant note. Incorrect assumptions, incomplete data. It was the language of an after-action report, not a civilian being hassled at a gate. It was precise, analytical, and dismissive. It was the verbal equivalent of swatting away a fly. For Corporal Vance, a man whose entire sense of self was built on a foundation of loud, unshakable certainty, it was an intolerable insult. His worldview was not a theory based on data. It was an absolute truth. "You advise me?" he snarled, stepping directly into her personal space, forcing her to either step back or be physically touched. He was close enough now to smell the faint, clean scent of laundry soap on her clothes. "You don't advise anyone, lady. I am the non-commissioned officer in charge of this checkpoint. I give the orders here. And my order to you is to move your ass off this ECP now, or I'll have you detained." She did not move back. She did not even seem to register his physical encroachment. Her spine remained ramrod straight. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon. It was a breathtaking display of passive resistance, a demonstration of a will so absolute that it required no physical defense. She was an immovable object, and Vance's unstoppable force was beginning to look foolish and impotent. He had backed himself into a corner. His threats had been ignored. His presence had been dismissed. His authority had been nullified. The lance corporals were watching, and in the small, brutal social hierarchy of a Marine fire team, to be seen as weak was a form of death. He had to escalate. He had to force a reaction. He had to prove that his power was real. His hand shot out not to strike her but to grab her arm, to physically compel her to move. It was a violation, an act of petty assault born of pure frustration. I said, "Move." The moment his fingers were about to close around the fabric of her sleeve, a sound ripped through the humid air, a sound that cut through the afternoon stupor like a bolt of lightning. It was the base-wide alarm system, a wailing, shrieking siren that every Marine is conditioned from day one to recognize and react to with primal urgency. It was not the rhythmic whoop of a fire drill or the steady tone of a test. It was the frantic, oscillating shriek of a genuine, life-or-death emergency. Simultaneously, a voice, cold and robotic, erupted from the loudspeakers mounted on the poles around the gate. Condition 1. Condition 1. All stations. This is not a drill. Asset breach at Facility Kilo 7.
Initiate lockdown protocol Sierra.
I repeat, this is not a drill. The world of Gate 3, once moving at a glacial pace, exploded into a frenzy of panicked, chaotic motion. The two lance corporals burst from the shack, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. One fumbled with the controls for the heavy steel barrier, while the other grabbed his rifle from the rack, his hands clumsy with shock. Corporal Vance froze for a half-second, his hand hovering inches from the woman's arm, his brain struggling to switch from the small drama he had created to the massive one that had just engulfed him. "Lock it down. Now!" Vance roared, finally finding his voice. He spun away from the woman, his personal grievance instantly forgotten, replaced by the ingrained muscle memory of his training. "Johnson, get on the radio, confirm the order. Miller, get those outbound barriers up. Nobody in, nobody out. Move. You worthless bastards, move." His orders were loud, forceful, and entirely by the book. They were the correct response for a standard lockdown. They were also, in this specific situation, catastrophically wrong. He was a man with a hammer following a procedure for hanging a picture, while the entire house was burning down around him. He was focused on the minutiae of his gate, sealing it tight, while the real crisis demanded it become a conduit, a strategic point for the response that was about to be unleashed. He was thinking like a gate guard. The woman, who had been the center of the conflict moments before, was now utterly ignored, a piece of civilian furniture in a room suddenly filled with armed men. But she was no longer still. The moment the alarm had sounded, a subtle but profound transformation had occurred. The placid neutrality of her face was gone, replaced by an expression of intense, focused concentration. Her body, once relaxed, was now coiled with a latent energy, like a compressed spring. She had gone from being a passive observer to the calmest, most alert person at the scene. While Vance was screaming orders and his subordinates were scrambling to execute them, she took 2 steps back, toward the edge of the road. From a hidden pocket in her slacks, she produced a small, matte black satellite phone, a device that no civilian, and very few military personnel, would ever have cause to carry. With economical, precise movements of her thumb, she powered it on and punched in a code. She did not dial a number. She entered a secure encryption key. The phone connected instantly. She raised it to her ear, turning her back slightly to the frantic activity at the guard shack. Her voice, when she spoke, was unrecognizable from the flat, detached tone she had used with Vance. It was still quiet, but now it was imbued with an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. It was a voice that did not expect to be obeyed, but simply knew it would be. Sea Dragon is on site. Sierra Protocol is a negative. I am countermanding. Repeat, I am countermanding lockdown protocol Sierra. A pause. She listened, her eyes scanning the empty road, the tree line, the sky. The asset is mobile. They will attempt exfiltration through the southeast quadrant. They are not the primary threat. The recovery team is the threat. They are operating under a compromised directive. They believe the asset is hostile. Corporal Vance, having successfully ensured the heavy steel barriers were clanging into place, overheard a fragment of her conversation. He turned, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. In his mind, in the middle of a base-wide crisis, this civilian was on a phone, babbling nonsense. It was the ultimate offense. What the hell do you think you're doing? He bellowed, storming toward her. Get off that phone. This is a military emergency. She held up a single finger, a simple, dismissive gesture that stopped him in his tracks more effectively than a drawn weapon. It was a gesture of such supreme confidence that it defied all logic. She continued speaking into the phone, her voice never wavering. Vector all base security to establish a 500-meter cordon around Gate 3. Do not engage. Do not obstruct. Their task is to contain the aftermath. Scramble air assets from Andrews. I want 2 Pave Hawks on station in 8 minutes. Weapons hot. Their target is not the asset. Their target is the recovery team's transport. Call sign hammer down. Disable, do not destroy. Execute. She lowered the phone. She had just taken command of the entire base's security apparatus, rerouted its emergency protocols, and scrambled a flight of combat helicopters from a different branch of the military, all in the space of 30 seconds. She had done it with the quiet efficiency of a woman ordering groceries. She turned her full attention to Corporal Vance. He stood before her, dumbfounded, his mouth slightly agape. The entire architecture of his reality was beginning to crumble. The words she had spoken were a foreign language of expertise, a dialect of command he had never been exposed to. Sea Dragon, Cordon Vector, weapons hot. These were not the words of a lieutenant's girlfriend. Corporal, she said, and her voice was now a precision instrument, sharp and cold as a scalpel. You are going to listen to me very carefully. In approximately 90 seconds, a black civilian SUV is going to approach this gate at high speed. It will not slow down. You are to immediately raise the barriers you just lowered. You will render the vehicle unimpeded access to this road. Vance stared at her, his mind a maelstrom of confusion, anger, and a terrifying, dawning suspicion that he was catastrophically out of his depth. I will not. My orders are to lock this gate down. No one gets in or out. Your orders are irrelevant, she stated, not as an insult, but as a simple statement of fact. They have been superseded. That vehicle contains the asset. The team pursuing it, call sign Hammer Down, is a 4-man special operations unit in a gray pickup truck. They are operating under a false premise and are a direct threat to the asset. They will arrive approximately 30 seconds after the SUV. You will allow the SUV to pass and then you will lower the barriers again, blocking the truck. You will not engage them. You will not speak to them. You will simply obstruct their path. Is that clear? Who are you? Vance stammered, the question a desperate plea for context, for something to hold onto as his world spun off its axis. She ignored the question. It was as unimportant as her name. Corporal, you have a choice. You can follow your obsolete orders and be responsible for the death of a Tier 1 national asset and the subsequent court-martial that will end your career and your freedom. Or you can obey my command and do your duty. The choice is yours. You have 60 seconds to make it. She did not wait for his answer. She turned to the 2 lance corporals, who were watching the exchange with wide, terrified eyes, their rifles held loosely at their sides. They had heard her words, and unlike Vance, their minds were not clouded by the fog of their own ego. They recognized the sound of genuine authority when they heard it. It radiated from her like heat from a furnace. You too, she said, her voice sharp. Get ready on those barriers. On my mark. They both flinched. Then, after a split second of hesitation and a fearful glance at their sputtering corporal, they nodded. They turned back to the control panels. They had chosen. They were now hers to command. In the distance, a sound began to grow. The high-pitched scream of a powerful engine being pushed to its absolute limit. It was coming from the base side. Headlights appeared, bouncing erratically as the vehicle navigated the base roads at a suicidal speed. 30 seconds, the woman said calmly. She looked at Vance. Your last chance, Corporal. Make a decision. Vance's face was pale, his bravado utterly shattered. He was a man caught between the rock of his training and the hard place of this woman's terrifying certainty. He looked from her cold, blue eyes to the rapidly approaching vehicle, and in that moment, The fragile shell of his arrogance cracked wide open. Fear, cold and pure, poured in. The fear of being wrong. The fear of consequences far beyond a bad fitness report. "Do it!" he croaked, the words barely a whisper. "Raise the barriers." The lance corporals didn't need to be told twice. They were already moving. With a hydraulic groan, the heavy steel plates began to retract into the ground. A moment later, a dust-covered black Ford Explorer shot through the gate at nearly 70 miles an hour, a blur of speed and desperation. It fishtailed onto the main road and disappeared. "Now," the woman commanded, her voice cutting through the lingering whine of the SUV's engine. The barriers slammed back down with a deafening clang. Not 10 seconds later, a battered gray Dodge Ram pickup truck screeched to a halt just feet from the newly raised obstacle. For men, clad in tactical gear and armed with short-barreled rifles, piled out. They looked less like soldiers and more like trained killers, their movements economical and predatory. The man in the lead, his face grim, started toward the guard shack. "Do not engage," the woman said, her voice a low murmur to the Marines at the gate. "Do not speak." The 4 operators stopped, their eyes scanning the scene. They saw the raised barriers. They saw the mute, stony-faced Marines. And they saw the small, unassuming woman in civilian clothes standing calmly just off to the side. They clearly did not know what to make of her. Above, a new sound was tearing through the sky, the distinct, percussive chop of helicopter rotors. 2 black HH-60 Pave Hawks were descending rapidly, their side doors open, revealing gunners manning pintle-mounted miniguns. The lead operator's radio squawked. He listened, his eyes widening slightly as he looked from the helicopters back to the woman. He spoke a single, sharp word into his radio, and his team immediately lowered their weapons. They began backing away toward their truck, their mission clearly, and very suddenly, aborted. The crisis was over. It had lasted less than 3 minutes. In that time, the woman had averted a catastrophic friendly fire incident, saved a priceless national asset, and taken de facto command of a major military installation, all from a forgotten checkpoint at the edge of the base. Now, another sound joined the fading thrum of the helicopters. A convoy of black Suburbans, lights flashing but sirens silent, was approaching the gate from the outside. They pulled up in a perfectly executed formation, and men in dark suits, Secret Service by the look of them, emerged to secure the perimeter. From the lead vehicle stepped a man who was a legend in the Marine Corps. Sergeant Major Marcus Thorne, the senior enlisted advisor for the entire base. He was a man whose face looked like it had been carved from naval tradition itself, a living monument of discipline and experience. Thorne's eyes swept the scene, taking in the operators, the helicopters, and the shaken gate guards. Then he saw her, the woman. A flicker of recognition, then profound relief, crossed his face. He strode toward her, his pace quick and purposeful. He came to a halt 3 feet in front of her. His back went ramrod straight. His hand snapped to his cover in the sharpest, most resonant salute of his long and storied career. He did not speak to her. He bellowed, his voice a force of nature that seemed to shake the very asphalt beneath their feet. A sound directed not at her, but at every other person present. "Attention on deck." The lance corporals, already on edge, snapped to a rigid, if clumsy, position of attention. The operators, who had been retreating, froze and turned, their professional detachment momentarily broken by confusion. Even the Secret Service agents paused their sweeps. The only person who did not react was Corporal Damian Vance. He stood rooted to the spot, his body numb, his mind finally comprehending the sheer, terrifying scale of his mistake. He was staring into the abyss of his own ignorance. Sergeant Major Thorne held his salute, his arm locked, his eyes fixed on the woman. Then, in a voice that was now quiet, respectful, and filled with a deference that bordered on reverence, he spoke to her. "General Reed, my apologies for the delay, ma'am. The internal comms were compromised. We established a hard line to your satellite phone as soon as we understood your position. Your command post is established at Building 1. The asset is secure and en route to the designated safe house. Your intervention was decisive. The words fell into the sudden, profound silence. General Reed. The name and rank descended upon Gate 3 like a bomb. It was a name whispered in the halls of the Pentagon and in the classified briefing rooms of CENTCOM. It was a name attached to operations that were never acknowledged, to victories that were never celebrated. Lieutenant General Evelyn Reed, commander of the newly formed Joint Strategic Operations Command, a shadowy organization responsible for the nation's most sensitive cyber and special warfare assets. She was a ghost, a legend, a 3-star general who spent more time in the field than in an office, known for her unnerving calm, her brilliant tactical mind, and her utter anonymity. She was not a public figure. She did not have an official photograph. To the vast majority of the military, she did not exist. And Corporal Damian Vance had just told her to move her ass. He had condescended to her, insulted her, and attempted to physically assault her. The ground beneath his feet seemed to sway. The hot, humid air suddenly felt thin and impossible to breathe. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a chilling certainty that his life, as he knew it, was over. General Reed returned the Sergeant Major's salute with a short, precise motion. "Thank you, Sergeant Major. Your efficiency is noted. Let's clean this up." She turned, and her pale blue eyes, now seeming as cold and vast as a winter sky, settled on Corporal Vance. He flinched. He looked like a child caught setting a fire, a pathetic mixture of guilt and terror. He expected to be screamed at, to be dressed down with the full, righteous fury of a wronged superior. He expected the end of his career to be loud and violent. But General Reed did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him, her gaze analytical, as if she were studying an interesting but flawed piece of equipment. "Corporal Vance," she said, her voice returning to that clinical, dispassionate tone. "Today you made a critical error. Not in etiquette and not in courtesy. Those are trivialities. Your error was tactical. It was an error in threat assessment." She took a step closer. He wanted to shrink away, but his feet were bolted to the pavement. "You encountered an unknown variable in your operational environment, an individual whose appearance did not align with your preconceived notions of authority. Instead of gathering intelligence, you chose to escalate based on a series of flawed assumptions. You assumed civilian meant ignorant. You assumed female meant weak. You assumed a quiet demeanor was a lack of consequence. These assumptions made you blind. They made you a liability." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, each one a perfectly placed nail in the coffin of his pride. "In a combat situation, your blindness would have gotten your men killed. Today, it nearly compromised a vital national security operation. Your failure was not one of disrespect, Corporal. It was a failure of imagination. And in my line of work, a failure of imagination is the only unforgivable sin." Vance could not speak. He could only nod, a pathetic, jerky motion of his head. He was waiting for the hammer to fall. Article 15, Captain's Mast, dishonorable discharge, prison. General Reed turned to Sergeant Major Thorne. "Sergeant Major, there will be no formal disciplinary action regarding Corporal Vance." A flicker of surprise crossed Thorne's stoic face. Vance felt a surge of impossible, disbelieving relief. "Instead," the general continued, her eyes still locked on Vance, "effective at 0800 tomorrow, the corporal is to be reassigned. He is to report to my office at the Pentagon. He will be my new executive assistant. He will carry my briefing books. He will drive my vehicle. He will learn, through direct and sustained observation, what authority actually looks like. He will learn that it is not loud. It is not arrogant. And it is not defined by the uniform you wear on your back, but by the competence you hold in your mind. This will be his education." Dismissed. She turned and walked toward the waiting Suburban without a backward glance, leaving Corporal Vance standing in the middle of the cracked asphalt, a humbled, broken man who had just been handed not a punishment, but a penance. A long, arduous, and deeply personal re-education, to be conducted at the right hand of the ghost he had tried to bully. The story of what happened at Gate 3 that August afternoon passed into the institutional lore of Quantico. Like all such stories, it grew and changed with each telling. In some versions, General Reed disabled the entire special operations team with her bare hands. In others, she personally flew one of the helicopters. But the core elements, the essential truths of the encounter, remained immutable. The arrogant corporal, the quiet, unassuming woman, the sudden crisis, and the devastating, silent display of absolute competence. It became a cautionary tale, a modern military fable told by grizzled gunnery sergeants to their new squads of corporals and sergeants. It was a lesson taught not in a classroom with a PowerPoint presentation, but in the quiet moments after a field exercise or over a beer in a dusty NCO club. It was a story about the danger of assumptions, about the critical importance of looking past the surface and assessing the reality of a situation. It was a story about how true strength, real authority, is often quiet, unassuming, and profoundly dangerous when underestimated. Years passed. The world turned. Wars began and ended. Technology shifted the landscape of battle. And at the Staff Non-Commissioned Officer Academy at Quantico, a new generation of Marine leaders were being forged. In a classroom, standing before a group of newly promoted corporals, was Gunnery Sergeant Damian Vance. He was a different man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. The arrogance in his eyes had been burned away, leaving behind a weary wisdom. His face was leaner, harder, but his voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured. He was one of the most respected instructors at the academy, known for his brutal honesty and his uncanny ability to prepare young NCOs for the complexities of modern leadership. He was at the end of a lecture on threat assessment. He had covered all the textbook scenarios, all the doctrinal answers. Then, he leaned against the lectern and looked out at the sea of young, eager, confident faces, and he saw himself from a decade ago. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "It's not in any of your manuals, but it's the most important lesson you will ever learn." And he told them the story. He did not spare himself. He painted a vivid, unflattering portrait of his younger self. The arrogance, the insecurity, the foolish pride. He told them about the quiet woman in civilian clothes, about his condescending words, about the alarm, and about the moment his world had been dismantled by a single, quiet command. He told them about his education, about the 2 years he spent as General Evelyn Reed's assistant. He spoke of the silent car rides, the endless classified briefings he barely understood, the 18-hour days spent watching a true master at work. He described how he learned that leadership wasn't about shouting. It was about listening, about seeing, about understanding. He learned that the most dangerous person in a room is often the one no one is paying attention to. "She never raised her voice to me," Vance told the silent, captivated classroom. "Not once. She didn't have to. Her presence was a constant correction. Her competence was a constant lesson. She taught me that the authority vested in your rank is a tool, nothing more. Real authority, the kind that makes people follow you into hell, is earned. It's earned through knowledge, through discipline, and through a humility that forces you to see the world as it is, not as you wish it to be." He pushed himself off the lectern and walked to the front of the classroom, his gaze passing over each young Marine. "You are all going to be put in charge of other Marines. You will hold their lives in your hands. And you will be tempted by the arrogance of your rank. You will be tempted to judge people based on what you see, on their gender, on their size, on the uniform they wear or don't wear. I am telling you now, that temptation is a poison. It will make you blind. It will make you weak. And it will get people killed." He stopped in the center of the room. "Your most important job as a leader is to question your own assumptions. Every person you meet is an unknown variable. Your duty is to gather intelligence, not to jump to conclusions. Be the quiet professional. Let your actions be your argument. Because you never know when you're standing at a forgotten gate in the middle of a hot afternoon, about to pick a fight with a ghost." The story concluded, but its moral hung in the air, a palpable force in the room. It was the ultimate lesson, delivered by the man who had been its first and most humbled student. The cycle was complete. The error had been corrected, not through punishment, but through a profound and transformative education. The arrogant corporal had been dismantled, and from his ruins, a true leader had been built. And the legend of General Reed, the quiet professional, the sea dragon, lived on, not as a tale of vengeance, but as a testament to the enduring truth that substance will always, in the end, triumph over style, and that the quietest voice in the room is often the one that carries the most weight.